السادة الكرام، نرحب بكم في الجلسة الحوارية الثالثة والتي تأتي بعنوان بين التحليل السياسي والدبلوماسية العامة مستقبل الخطاب حول المنطقة. يدير هذه الجلسة السيد كوغلين المحرر التنفيذي لشؤون الدفاع والسياسة الخارجية في صحيفة ديلي تيليغراف. كما نرحب بمتحدثي هذه الجلسة السيد مايكل راتني مستشار أول في مركز الدراسات الاستراتيجية والدولية، ونرحب بالسيد تشارلز حلاب الرئيس التنفيذي لمجلس الأعمال الأمريكي السعودي، والسيد الشهابي كاتب ومحلل سياسي واقتصادي متخصص في شؤون السعودية والمنطقة العربية. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third session entitled Between Political Analysis and Public Diplomacy, the Future of Discourse on the Region. This session will be moderated by Mr. Coughlin, Executive Defense and Foreign Affairs Editor at the Daily Telegraph. We would like to welcome on the stage Mr. Michael Ratney, Senior Advisor, Center of Strategic and International Studies. And welcome to the stage Mr. Charles Hallab, CEO of USA Saudi Business Council. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Al-Shehabi, political and economic writer and analyst specialized in Saudi Arabian and Arabian affairs.
Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here at the Saudi Media Forum. We have a stellar cast here to discuss some of the most pressing issues of the day, trying to work out how to analyze the events going on in the region becomes increasingly more difficult given the way states are now trying to prevent people acquiring information. And if you look around the region today, the number of conflicts taking place and potential conflicts is quite alarming. You know, if you look at North Africa and Libya, if you look at Sudan, if you look at Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Iran, and of course Yemen, you've got a whole series of important regional security challenges that really do require attention and very careful political analysis so that we can help to stabilize the region. Of course, the Yemen conflict is one that's been very familiar to people here in Saudi Arabia and has caused a great deal of anxiety. And I think the root causes of this problem are something that we need to look at. And now you've been following the Yemen conflict particularly closely and the impact it's had here on Saudi Arabia.
Well, the Yemen conflict was an interesting one from a media perspective because the Saudi government was particularly open in explaining its logic and the issues behind it. The foreign ministry came out with very clear statements and it named the UAE as the party that it held responsible for what was happening in Yemen, which traditionally has not been the case really, but I think that in this case you had a situation where public policy or public communication was very transparent. That was picked up by the media. Obviously, then you got the UAE response, and then you got allies of the UAE or allies of Saudi Arabia and international media having conflicting narratives. But I think it was one case where we saw that the government very clearly expressed its position and very clearly expressed the logic and the problem and why it was doing what it was doing. And obviously it caused an explosion in social media reactions in the kingdom, in the Emirates and abroad. And it caused quite a lot of media coverage internationally also. And then Saudi Arabia had to stand up to the narrative that was being pushed by the UAE and by affiliated lobbies, if you want. A very interesting narrative came out in Washington which said that the kingdom has gone Islamist, it has gone radical, it has gone anti-Semitic. Obviously all absurd, but they got traction in Washington. And I think that then the sort of Saudi private social media machinery came into place to respond to that. But I think that is something that the ambassador also will have something to say of, because from Washington's perspective, that narrative became very strong.
Michael, I mean, you follow this also very closely. I mean, what is the American perspective of this dispute? And a lot of people outside the region regard this as being deeply unhelpful in terms of maintaining regional security, that two such important countries are having these difficulties. What is your perspective, and what is the truth behind all this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great example of a difficult conflict in the region for the United States, in this case between two very strong partners. But it's also indicative of a larger issue, which is where does the truth lie? So you have statements by governments, for example. You have commentary and analysis by observers, I guess including me at some point. And then you have advocates on social media, one side or the other. And it creates this kind of cacophony of noise around this issue, and it becomes very difficult to figure out where the reality is. Sometimes the reality is who has the loudest voice, who seems to be the most convincing. That's not necessarily the truth. As Ali pointed out, on the UAE-Saudi story, a lot of the noise rose above the truth. And you find narratives in the media, including in the United States, about Saudi Arabia that simply aren't true. But because they're the loudest, or in some cases they come out of the mouths of people that some people regard as credible, that gets adopted and it gets picked up by the mainstream media. And once it's in there, it's very hard for people to start to, I'm sorry to say, but to think for themselves. And that leaves policymakers in Washington and other capitals kind of struggling for how do they react to that? Who is to blame? Whose side should we take? In the case of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think Washington's view is they don't want to have to take a side. Two important countries, important relationships. We'd prefer that they be working together rather than be at odds with each other. And yet, the narrative in the media, whether it's from mainstream media outlets, from commentators, from social media analysts, make it extraordinarily difficult to come up with a coherent approach.
And Charles, do you think the fact that it's so difficult to get accurate information from what's going on the ground in Yemen makes this even more challenging? First of all, large areas of the country are controlled by the Houthis. They are supplied by all kinds of other people. It is very difficult for Western journalists, observers, to get an accurate picture of what is going on the ground. Does that make it more difficult for people to make a more balanced judgment on the issues at stake?
I suppose it does, but I'm not a political analyst as much as I am a business one. On the issue of Yemen in particular, and perhaps as a corollary, Sudan, I do agree with my fellow panelists that there's a lot of risk with the noise. And the more clarity that we can provide, I think the less risk there will be. I'm not worried about the White House or President Trump. When the Crown Prince visited on 2 occasions at the White House and outside the White House, I was in the room when the President assured the Crown Prince of his sympathetic view for Saudi Arabia. So I'm not really worried about the White House or President Trump being swayed by the noise, but I am worried about the noise wreaking havoc in Washington otherwise, as the ambassador mentioned. And I'm worried about it among my constituents, who are the business executives of the United States. Less so here, of course, but I face a constant battle of combating misperceptions about the kingdom in particular, but the region as a whole. And I'm afraid that some aspects of this particular conflict have only exacerbated that and created a greater challenge for folks like me that are trying to bring businesses together from across the ocean.
I mean, clearly this is a very important issue for Saudi Arabia and the region. And, you know, we all look at this and we're all looking for solutions and a way forward rather than just getting stuck in this rather unhelpful confrontation over who's doing what and who says what. Is there a way out of this, Ali, do you think? That would...
Not as long as there's politics going on. And I think what happens is that you are looking for governments to improve their game. And I think the interesting thing about the Yemen crisis was that the Saudi government improved its game. And there's a credibility gap now. People look at what Saudi Arabia says, and people look at what the UAE says. And the UAE itself has a very sophisticated media infrastructure. But they have lost on the credibility side of the issue when it comes to Yemen and Sudan, for example. So I think on this crisis, the Saudi government has been very open. The foreign ministry has been making very clear statements, have explained the Saudi position very, very clearly. And that, to me, is an interesting indicator of how public communication has improved in the kingdom. And today, I think generally, the credibility battle between the kingdom and the UAE on Yemen and on Sudan has been won by the kingdom, because people see that what the kingdom has been saying has been true, and that UAE denials have had much less credibility. So as long as we have politics, we're going to face this problem. The question is, can we play the game better? And I think that we are seeing, on the Saudi side, very importantly, the game is getting better.
Which is very necessary, because apart from the rift with the UAE, Saudi Arabia also had to contend with a lot of, I would say, left-of-centre criticism of its actions in Yemen. And the Houthis and their backers were very adept in putting forward a very false narrative that a lot of people in the international media were happy to accept at the expense of Saudi Arabia. So,
no doubt. I mean, if you draw a graph between the way the Saudi public communication took place during the Yemen war and where it is today, there's a huge difference, a huge improvement in the skills and capacities and communication. And that's very important. And it's very nice to see that the kingdom today is in a position where it has a credible position. It's seen as credible. Its positions are clear. And frankly, it is what it says publicly is what it says privately. And that, I think, has been a very good case study of how the game, playing the game, has improved in this kingdom.
Right.
If I may.
Yeah, please, Charles.
And I couldn't agree more, although I will say that I think the kingdom still has a ways to go in terms of making its voice heard loudly enough, clearly enough in the United States. And they're combating lobbies, as you referred to earlier, that are well-developed, well-funded, and the Saudi Arabia needs a better return on its investment in public relations, media, and advocacy in the
No
United
doubt,
States.
there is still a long way to go. There's still a very long way to go to improve the whole public communication of the kingdom, whether it's done by the public or the private sector. But the foundation is government communication. And in foreign policy, when the foreign ministry starts to communicate clearly and openly, and its statements have meat on the bone, then you have a good foundation to start. So I think that's where I see a good progress.
Agreed.
And Michael, if you're still wearing your diplomatic hat, how would you be addressing this issue diplomatically to try and resolve it? I mean, one thought that occurs to me is that although the Yemen conflict has caused a lot of global disruption, particularly with the attacks in the Red Sea, and for a short time became a global issue, because of other events, it's slightly fallen off the radar, and you don't feel that there's the same level of international focus being applied to resolving the Yemen conflict. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely fair assessment. I mean, one of the challenges is that the conflict in Yemen and all of the manifestations of it are no less difficult and no less important to the countries of the region, and yet there's a lot of competition, right? Whether it's Venezuela or Greenland or Ukraine or China, there's a finite capacity for media organizations to focus on an issue, and even the public, or policymakers in Washington. They may know that something's important, but there's some crisis that's even more important. And it's hard to get people's attention. When that happens, it becomes very difficult because then you don't know what to believe anymore, right? So in the middle of all of this, in the middle of all of these other controversies all over the world, this Saudi-Emirati rift opens up, initially because of Yemen. And into that, it's something of a vacuum. You have a smaller number of media outlets trying to cover it. You have social media intensely focused on it. You have governments that have a responsibility to talk about it, but even they have competition with other issues. So it becomes very difficult. If I were still a diplomat, the simplest advice is turn down the volume, right? So we have again, for the United States, two important partners. We would advise them, we need them to work together and to work with us. This intense polarization in the media, which is creating false narratives in many cases, doesn't help anybody, right? So I don't know that the United States or any other government is going to be in a position to mediate, but they can certainly advise. And the big piece of advice is turn down the intensity, turn down the volume, turn down the contrast, and talk about all of those things that we have to share in order to confront the real challenges in the region.
And Charles, I mean, obviously you look at these issues from a business perspective, a trade perspective. Have you seen a negative impact on potential investment opportunities in the region because of what is going on over Yemen and also over Sudan, where there's a lot of tension over that issue as well?
It's hard to say that we've experienced concern over those particular areas or issues, but as I said earlier, just misconception about the stability of the region, the risk profile of the region is epidemic, I think, in the United States, it's fair to say. And we face an epidemic in the US, as we probably do all over the world, of false narratives and propaganda over accurate information. So all of that is an obstacle to progress, and in particular, business progress, because when businessmen and women are confused or unsure, they do not act. And that is a challenge for us at the U.S.-Saudi Business Council and a challenge for the two governments who are looking for these two countries to make good on their commitments to enhance one another's trade, investment, and business relationship. And this is the moment for that. So whether it's Yemen or Sudan or Iran, those are distractions at the very least and impediments at the most.
Because the irony here, Ali, is that we have an American president who's made it quite clear that boosting trade and business ties with allies all over the world is his number one priority. It seemed when he came here last year, it was quite clear that his main priority was to make sure that the US got really good trade deals. And that has been the pattern in all his dealings with foreign governments. And at the same time, they don't seem to be investing enough in resolving underlying issues that could affect the trade issues, the inward investment. Again, is this something that you feel here in Riyadh, that you've got a president that wants one thing, but other issues are undermining the achievement of that objective?
Look, President Trump has a particular characteristic to him. And he likes grandiose statements and signing ceremonies and moves, and people understand that in the region. But I think the machinery of cooperation between the Kingdom and the United States continues, and as it was before. There still has been an increase in that, inbound investment from America in the high-tech space, which has happened under the Trump administration. So it hasn't been affected really much by the geopolitical picture. I think people who look at the region, they already ascribe a certain amount of political risk to the region. The Middle East will always have noise. There will always be issues that come out. But I think intelligent capital knows how to differentiate between different sectors of the Middle East. And I think that with President Trump, the focus on technology, for example, and the focus on data centers and the focus on AI has led to fruitful, actual agreements and decisions being made to establish operations on the ground in the kingdom. So to that extent, I have not seen, and maybe Charles can say better from the business perspective, but I have not seen a negative impact on what is being carried out commercially on the US-Saudi space because of regional noise.
Michael, do you feel that the way the Trump administration does business makes life easier or more difficult for the established infrastructures that normally deal with relations with countries like Saudi Arabia?
It's a great question. I think it makes it both easier and more difficult simultaneously. I think it makes it easier because there's a clear sense that the relationship is in a good place, that the two countries are open for business, that where there's kind of challenging commercial environments, that there's a will and a desire to overcome them because it's so important that there's a strong business relationship. So I think the business community looks at it and says, this is great. But they also look at it and they say, there's also a certain amount of unpredictability. So
they don't like that.
Yeah, businesses, you know, if you're just selling something, you'd like to make the deal, close the deal, and move on. If that business relationship involves a long-term investment, that's different because you want predictability over the course of many, many years. You want to know that the regulatory environment is going to be the same. You want to know that your own government is going to continue in the same way and support those businesses. So you have, yeah, sure, you have a message that says we're open for business. That message is clear in Washington and it's clear in Riyadh. But then there's this kind of element of political risk and political uncertainty that businesses have to listen to because they're making long-term decisions. So it's really both. It would be nice if the two merged somehow and we had both the predictability, the reliability on the kind of political side, and a sense that the two countries were open for business.
And Charles, do you have any thoughts on how to improve the business environment against this challenging geopolitical backdrop?
Well, I'm a big fan of education in all its forms. I think as part of my mandate at the Council and working with our stakeholder partners in both governments, we need to do a much better job of educating the two business communities about one another. I think Saudis sometimes are frustrated because they think the relationship between Trump and MBS should mean that every American business is clamoring to come to Saudi Arabia to invest. The US doesn't work that way. In some ways, there's a political dimension. Michael was just about to touch on it, perhaps. Saudi Arabia and Trump are proxies for one another in certain parts of US media. And so that's a challenge. We have to be able to convince business executives who are Democrats, ardent Democrats, that Saudi Arabia is a worthwhile destination for their money. And Ali referenced intelligent capital, and I agreed with everything he said, but I think in order to take us really to the next stage, we need to be convincing, for lack of a better way of putting it, less intelligent capital. Because, yeah, we don't need to convince the most sophisticated folks. The Larry Finks and Stephen Schwartzman, they're fine. They understand the lay of the land here. I need to be able to go to Tennessee, Idaho, and Minnesota and convince executives there of the long-term prospects of Saudi Arabia. And by the same token, I need to convince Saudi Arabian partners and businesses of the value of doing business with the United States and with U.S. Stakeholders in the long term.
A key element of education is having accurate information. I don't think anybody studying, whether it's the sciences, the humanities, will achieve anything unless they are working on the basis of accurate information. And one of the problems we have today, which we've touched on, are these false narratives that we have to deal with, particularly with major conflicts. And we've also got the challenge coming down the road, in fact it's already here, of AI adding to the confusion. So, for example, if you look at the Iran conflict, which is a very important security challenge for this region, we've got a massive American armada assembled around Iran, but we don't know what's going on in Iran because of the internet blackout. And then within that internet blackout, there are hostile actors putting out false narratives that confuse the situation. We've seen this in other conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. How do we operate? How do we make proper judgments against this background? Are there, Ali, measures that the international community should start adopting to try and root out these false narratives so that we can make proper judgments based on proper facts?
Look, you will always have false narratives because there are people who have a vested interest in pushing a false narrative. So in any crisis, you are going to have elements that come out to push a false narrative. But the start is for you as a government or as a society or as a country to establish credibility and give your narrative first. I think in the kingdom, we used to be late with that. The kingdom would take time to comment on issues. Headlines happen within hours, if not minutes. And sometimes a piece of news would come out and the kingdom would wait a week before it denies it, for example. So I think that is getting much better because the most important thing is for the source of the news to be, if you don't supply news, you create a vacuum and somebody else will come in. So one way to stop false narratives is to make sure that you are the first, that you come out with a story. That's why I say the Yemen crisis was a good case study in how the kingdom has improved its game in communication. But you do that, you are going to face false narratives anyway from the opposing side, whoever they are. And with social media and with the manipulation of social media, we know that all the countries, including the United States, have sophisticated infrastructures built to manipulate social media. So you are going to face false narratives. So then that becomes the defense. So your first step is to have credibility yourself, to issue information quickly, not to wait, because headlines are made in an hour or two and not in a week. And then to have a robust capacity to defend when the false narratives come, which they inevitably will.
I think Winston Churchill once said that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets its trousers on.
Yes.
So that sort of sums it all up.
And that was before social media.
And that was before social media. And as you said, false narratives, propaganda has been around a very long time. You look at going back to the turn of the last century. But wearing your former diplomat's hat, Michael, I mean, how much effort goes into trying to work out what is real and what is nonsense when you are trying to operate in very complex areas? And has any thought been, I mean, at the moment there's lots of talk about blocking social media platforms, giving them access to teenagers. Is there an argument in saying, well, if these platforms are pushing out propaganda on behalf of hostile states, then we should deny them the airspace? A good example in the UK is in Scotland, which has been campaigning for independence. There are all these social media platforms that were pro-Scottish independence. The moment the Iranian blackout was implemented, they all disappeared, right? So, I mean, that gives you, that's a very, very current example of what is going on in the social media space. And I'd be fascinated in your take of it, somebody who's been at the front line of this particular challenge.
Oh, it's extraordinarily challenging. A policymaker, whether it's a president or a secretary of state or a minister of government, is getting information from 100 different sources. Now, you like to think they're just getting the information from the most reliable sources, from an embassy overseas, from an intelligence agency, from a reliable news outlet. But they're doing the same thing everyone else is doing. They're looking at their phone night and day. And a lot of times, on the most consequential issues, Russia's intention to invade Ukraine, for example, American or Israeli plans with respect to the Iranians is the most recent one. They may well be hearing from embassies, they may well be hearing from intelligence agencies and news outlets, but they're also hearing from 100 different sources on social media, some of which sound very real, but as you point out, some of them might be completely fake, or some of them might not be news, they might be advocacy. They might know that they're extremely appealing for policymakers to listen to, but completely false. So that challenge has become very, very great right now, and I think it's incumbent on leaders to do their best to put down their phones and to listen to sources that they know are reliable, or to understand that they might be reading something about Iranian intentions, nuclear intentions, US military intentions, but they are well briefed on whether or not that's an objective media source or whether that is a disinformation effort, an advocacy effort, what it is. It might be important that they know that it's out there, but they just need to know the context. I would add, I recall well during the Biden administration, in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was also a lot of information out there. There was predictions, there was social media commentary, there were denials. And at the time, the White House made the decision to take, in that case, some of the most sensitive intelligence information and make it public. So the public saw the same thing policymakers were seeing, and could make decisions not based on disinformation or noise, but on the same very sensitive information that, that senior leaders were seeing. Compare that with where we are now on Iran, where there's very little information out there. There's a blackout of the internet in Iran, so we don't really know what's going on the ground. There's leaks to the media, and there is the one source that everybody is watching, which is what is President Trump saying. But even that varies from day to day. So you compare the ability to make plans for the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with now the inability to plan about what to do in the event of military strikes against the Iranians, and it's quite a contrast. And I would say for businesses, for policymakers, and for the general public, it's a very frustrating experience.
It is. And of course, this must, Charles, affect business judgments. I mean, when you've got all this noise around you, and you're trying to make very important decisions with vast amounts of money involved about long-term investments, it must be very difficult to navigate your way through this.
Indeed, it does. You know, Americans on the whole are not known for their great knowledge, depth and breadth of their knowledge of the world outside the U.S. That is a challenge we face, including with business executives who have all kinds of weird ideas about the Middle East and even about Saudi Arabia in particular. I'll get a call from an executive in Chicago who will ask me if I feel safe. Chicago, you know, just had 600 and something murders. His neighbors was carjacked, and he's concerned about my safety in Riyadh. It's a silly anecdote, but it's a telling one in that there's not enough fluent information in the U.S. in particular about the kingdom. And I feel like I'm repeating myself from my prior comments, but that is probably the greatest challenge I face in this role. And in my humble view, it's the greatest existential threat we face as humanity now. That people are licensed to create their own realities, their own worlds, their own truths. And while folks like you are working so hard to put out facts and analysis, people as a whole are opting more and more to stay within their echo chambers online and stick with first impressions becoming permanent impressions. And so that's what I'm combating. I'm combating first impressions and trying to create nuance and understanding that varies people from positions they've picked up on TikTok or YouTube. And I'm not talking about kids. I'm talking about people at senior levels of business and shockingly, government.
Yeah. Well, wearing my journalistic hat, I would contend that the answer is for people to rely more on what we call legacy media, because for all its faults, news organizations, established news organizations, do have responsibilities to try to the best of their ability to provide fair and accurate coverage of what is going on. So, for example, the intelligence briefings you're referring to on Ukraine, I was party to in February 2022, and the intelligence community reached out and said, you know, you've really got to look at this. And of course, as a journalist, you're thinking, well, why are they telling me this? Is this another bluff to stop Putin invading Ukraine, or is this really happening? But at least we are going through that process, whereas on social media, it just goes out and all people just make their claims. And the other thing which I find quite worrying is that you get heads of state using social media in quite an irresponsible way, not mentioning any names. But and it's not just confined to the US. A lot of governments Even in London, the British government has its own Twitter feed and other social media, not Twitter, X feed and other social media things, where they're just trying to drive the government narrative where it doesn't get examined or questioned. And I think accountability is quite important for those of us who want to make sure that people understand the truth of what is going on. Is that a fair point, Ali?
Very much so, but very difficult to get. Ultimately, there is so much false narratives going around in the media. And there's so many people with a vested interest to do that. And there's so much manipulation carried out by governments also. So you have to, I go back to my point. As a government, you have to be quick. You have to be credible. So what you say is the truth. And then you have to be waiting and resilient when the false narratives come out to be able to fight back. But that is the world that you are in today. You are no longer dealing with just distinguished journalists. You're dealing with all sorts of people all around the world. And some of these people have an impact. And it makes the job of public diplomacy more critical, and the failure of public diplomacy more dangerous, because the space is being filled up by other people at any moment. You are either engaged or you have opened up the space to your enemies to take over the subject. And that is a lesson that everybody is learning.
And of course, one of the problems here is if you are a responsible body, before you put a narrative out, you do want to make the right checks and to make sure that what you're putting out is accurate, whereas many of your adversaries don't bother with that formality.
But you have to you have to accommodate that and err on the side of speed. Sometimes you will make a mistake, and you can correct that. But it's better to be quick and aggressive, to fill the space, to set the headline before the opposition comes in to do it for you.
And Michael, quick last word from you. I mean, in your career, has this got worse in recent years? And is there one particular factor you would identify that's made your life, certainly when you were a diplomat, a lot more difficult?
Yeah, I hate to keep coming back to social media and blaming all the ills of the world on it, but for policymakers, it's become the single greatest challenge. You know, once upon a time, they knew what the various sources of information were, and they were much more kind of methodical about it. Now there's just a blizzard of information, some of which is so appealing and so readily available that you just tend to give it more credence than you would something that's a kind of methodically prepared report by experts. And so essentially, whether it's journalists or intelligence analysts or policymakers, they're all in competition with information for speed. And that's the thing where social media beats it every time. And that's gotten much, much, much worse.
Do you want a final word, Charles?
Well, maybe as cliche as it sounds, I think all the more important for us to encourage human-to-human interaction. It's events like these, it's conversations like these that can combat the ills of social media.
And highlight the threats we're facing.
Indeed.
Well, I just want to thank our panel for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لكم. Thank you very much.